Hey everybody, welcome to this webinar on Elastic Support Assistant with Azure OpenAI. My name's Steve 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗃. I'm a Search AI leader at Elastic, and I'm joined today by Chris Blaisure, who I've been working with for a number of years. He's our field technology leader, and he and I are going to talk you through how we've built some really amazing Search AI powered technology inside of Elastic that leverages Azure OpenAI. So to get us kicked off, what I'm going to do first is just talk a little bit about how search is changing. You've probably noticed this if you've been using any search engine or ChatGPT or whatever. And what we're used to for the last few decades is you do a search, you use keywords, you're trying to convey what you're looking for, and you usually get a result of, a bunch of links that you have to click through and find the answer. But with the power of generative AI and an amazing search engine like Elastic, you're actually able to build a whole new experience. And it goes from, doing a keyword search where you're hunting for the answer to something like what Stack Overflow is implemented on top of Elastic and Azure, which is a generative search experience. So instead of just trying to use keywords and then getting a bunch of links that you have to, you know, parse through to find the answer, you can type in the exact question that you want to ask, and the likelihood of you getting an answer is now much better because of the use of, Elastic's vector search engine and using techniques like retrieval augmented generation, which we're going to talk about today. So you've probably seen this already in some of your daily workflow, or you're building these things today. And so if that's the case, you're going to, I think, today learn a whole lot about best practices and how we built what we've built inside of Elastic. So just to give you a quick overview of what retrieval augmented generation is with Elastic, it's a new pattern that people are employing to build these generative experiences, and it all still starts with a question, but that question's moving from keyword slash lexical to semantic. Now, when you ask these questions, you're typically going to ask it and you're going to need access to certain data that has the answer. And this is where RAG, the power of RAG, really starts to come into play. When I do that query, it's going to go into Elasticsearch and it's going to ask that question both on the lexical side and the semantic side. We call that hybrid search. And it usually ends up giving you better results than any one of those by themselves. You grab that private data that's completely secure and not going to go anywhere besides your infrastructure. Then you put that data into the context window for what you're going to send over to the LLM. And Chris is going to go into detail on this. And then what you get back is an answer rather than a bunch of links to sift through. And that experience alone has been such a game changer for so many people already. And you're going to see that today. But you've probably experienced this already. And Elastic supports the entire workflow from beginning to end, including integrating with, LLMs from folks like Azure with their OpenAI implementation. Now, this slide is just a quick architecture. We're not going to go through this, of course, it's way too busy, but it's meant to give you an idea of all the possibilities you have at your disposal when you're trying to build a RAG solution. You think about things like query rewriting, re-ranking. How do my data pipelines get built? How do I orchestrate this thing? How do I evaluate models, observe those models, and implement guardrails to be able to build something that's, intuitive and predictable for the end user? So with that, Chris is going to show an actual architecture. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk through what we've built inside Elastic, and you can take it away.
All right, so as you showed the large architecture and what's possible, there's a lot of different ways we can do it. When we think about iterations and how we get from point A to point B, we had very specific use cases that we're trying to solve. And so on our side at Elastic, what we said is we want to have a technical support assistant. So if you have a problem at Elastic with your cluster, you want to understand a product a little bit deeper, we wanted you to have a self-service motion that you could go and talk with something that was educated about our products. And that was a good fit for the RAG architecture. So a subset of what you showed is kind of what we built and what you see here. And so roughly we've been working over a year trying to figure out the right pieces and tuning it. And so we'll talk about that some more. But at a high level, we have our Kubernetes shared infrastructure that you see here. That's really the front end, back end. It's kind of standard three-tier architecture on our side. And then we use Elasticsearch, like you would imagine. We have Elser creating the vectors for our vector search and creating what's able for us to use in hybrid search and RFF, things that we've learned along the way to tune our Elasticsearch. We actually pushed the prompts with the search results to OpenAI through Azure. And that's really the heart of this, right? When we talk about generative AI and what we're trying to do with chatbots and assistants, that partnership with Azure and OpenAI has been really good to us as we start thinking about the future and what we want to do on this. We also have been using our data sources on our blogs and our knowledge base articles internally, so we can add all this together in this architecture that you see here, and really deliver a support chat experience for our customers. And so if I show you how it works today, what this view that you see today is an internal version of our support assistant that we've recently allowed our customers to access through the support assistant. And so here we can ask any question in the kind of the technical domain that we would want. And so here we'll do an example is what is ILM? And for those that are familiar, we have index lifecycle management on Elasticsearch. And so what it's done is it's went through and it used Elasticsearch based on our query, and it came back with some results. And so a lot of times this part of it is abstracted from us as users of chatbots. We don't know how this is working. What we do in our system is we actually allow our users to see what information is being retrieved back and what were the accurate results. And this is the power of Elasticsearch. So what we're passing through to Azure and to OpenAI is those three connected dots there that you see, those checkboxes. What we've done is we've grabbed the content that search found that was relevant to the question being asked. We passed it over to OpenAI, and they combined that with the prompt that we gave them, combined it, and gave the response to the back that you see on the screen. And so this is a very powerful architecture, as we talked about, and we're seeing some returns now as people have been using it. We've been using it internally for many months, and just recently making, like I said, available to customers, we're starting to see questions come through. And it's not just related to what you would think about troubleshooting, but you can also ask a question like, what is the value of ILM? And so there's kind of this combination thought where you think about, okay, in a document, we had technical understanding of what is ILM, and then we start to think, well, as a user of it, why would I use it? And you can start to augment your question to answer these type of things that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And so it found other documents. You can see how it's very similar to the first a group of responses that said, hey, technically, this is ILM overview. But these answers here were generated by generative AI, and it's pulling together what it understands as value add for customers and users of Elasticsearch, but then combining what it knows about the system, and that's really the power of putting these two together.
So, Chris, it seems like this is where we're really taking advantage of the reasoning capabilities of Azure OpenAI, right? You give it all this data, but with the context of that question, it's able to kind of recreate a new way to present that data that's highly accurate, right?
Exactly. That's the generative part grounded with the information that we sent it. So we've sent it what we know about ILM, and it's filling in the gaps, and it's doing a great job so far for us.
You know, another thing I love about this is that I can see you have like thumbs up, thumbs down. And to me, that's a great way to say, how did I do? And if you think about traditional search experiences, it's really hard for companies to understand how they did because people abandon searches, right? When they don't find what they're looking for. And you have to make a lot of assumptions. Now it's like, hey, is this the right answer or did it not help?
Yeah, so it's a great point. We've used the thumbs up and thumbs down mechanism to get feedback from our users. When you
Yeah.
think about building a product, a lot of times what I'm reading about when there's a quick rush to go and implement some generative AI feature, what we were really highly concerned about was accuracy. And so we took a long time to understand, is the response that we're getting accurate? And so from the very beginning, the best indicator we got of that was people giving us feedback. And so when we had lower volumes, we had test groups and they say, yes, this is a good answer, no. And we gave them a little bit of criteria saying, is it technically accurate? Was the tone right? And so we could give that as a manual feedback mechanism to us to know what we need to tweak as we start making this better every day.
Yeah, and it kind of gives us a new vector, pardon the pun, to collect feedback and make it better, which is really exciting.
Yeah, very much so. And then that's the kind of the first at the volumes of when you're first kind of beta testing, you got your first rollout, you start to have this low volume and you start looking at every response. But as you start getting more and more volume, and I'll show here in a minute kind of where we're at, that's not a sustainable path. And so what we have to do is start to think about other mechanisms to understand, is it working, right? And that is it working? Technically, is it working? As in, are they getting responses or are we erroring out? We have timeouts, things like that. But also, is it accurate in its response? Is the sentiment and tone right? I think that's where we're looking at now to evolve this from a single thumbs up, thumbs down by a person to more automated systems that allow us to do that.
Yeah, I love it.
So where we're at today, to give kind of a timeline, this is very early for us. So I'm really happy. The team that we launched actually at the just last month, so roughly 30 days, been in production with our customer-facing version of this chatbot. And so what you see here on the screen now is kind of what our traction looks like. So if you think about at scale, how do you monitor this type of conversation? Well, we happen to have a tool, Elasticsearch Observability, that helps us in this, where we start thinking about what is the points that we're concerned about. So we know we've had over 10,000 since August 29th when we did kind of a soft launch and started actually talking with our customers about this. We've had over 10,000 chat completions. That basically means question and answer coming back. We know we've seen some errors along the way. We've tried different models. We've seen size limits be a part of it, and so we're monitoring those errors on that side. That's what's really important to us. Obviously, we want a good user experience. But part of user experience is also around our latency. Like, no one wants to ask a question and sit around for 20 minutes waiting for a response to come back.
Right.
And so we understand we have latency both at the search layer and at the large language model which with Azure has allowed us to like measure that and see what is our latency between the two and what's the experience we're giving our users. So that's what you kind of see here. You see how we're monitoring that experience and making sure that everybody's getting an experience that's acceptable on their side.
Chris, I really like this because, I've been talking to customers in the field for about a year about this stuff, and a lot of people are still at the earlier stages, like they're getting to the point where they have something maybe running, but this is kind of that next stage of thinking or maturity is like, okay, how do I monitor this stuff? And so it's good for people to know that when you get to that point, we have a lot of, opinions on this and a lot of capability around it.
Yeah, the insights that we get here allow us to make business level decisions as well. So when I think about the models that I pay for and ROI, like I know how much I can push in our, whether it's pay as you go or PTU models as we start to build our business plan around it. Because frankly, not everybody has unlimited funds, right? So what
Yep.
we do is we think about, well, how many chats can I get into a certain window? What's it going to cost me? And what's the value of it? And I think that's where it gets really interesting. So as a data point for us, what we said is, I said August 29th is when we actually launched it. Over the first month, we had roughly 600 times somebody used our assistant rather than opening a case. And so, which is a very early indicator of like it's kind of working, right?
Yeah.
So we're not making any assumptions about how it changes the overall trend or things like that, but it's really this idea of self-service. So not only does it allow us to free up our support engineers to work on something else, right? But also like the experience as a user, I would much rather ask a question and get an answer quickly and fix the problem and move on in my own experiences than like open a case, wait a few hours for somebody to respond, do a back and forth dance. And if I can self-service, I think that self-service is just as important as kind of this idea of case abandonment or things like that, right? So that from that standpoint, I think we got really good early success numbers here.
I think that's really powerful because, like, I would ask you, the viewer, to think about the last time you used a support chatbot on a website that wasn't AI powered. And there's like a few things. It's either choose your own adventure where they give you like, you can go these three routes, or it's open, you type in what you want. But in my experience, most of the time it leads to having to talk to a human anyway. So for you to say how many, times we've had people actually get the answer from a chat is pretty stunning, I think.
Yeah, and we know we just launched it early, and there's a lot that we can do when we think about adoption of users that are coming into our support portal. Because a lot of times what people will do is they only use a support portal when there's a problem. And so they start getting in there. So we see about 40% of our users, I think that's the number, is returning users. So once they know about it, then they come back to it and they say, hey, let me ask that question again. But until you like have the problem to go check it out, you didn't know it's there. And so we're going to get this growing population that we're hoping for of people that know it's here and start asking their questions there as a starting point and educating our group from there rather than have them come just for problems.
That makes sense. Chris, have you noticed that people are starting to use it as a learning tool, not just like a support, I need help right now type of tool?
Yeah.
So,
I think the best data we have is actually our internal usage. So I think from the very beginning, when we launched it to customers a month ago, we embedded it in the case creation process.
okay.
So basically, because that was the whole idea. We're like, listen, if you're going to create a case, why don't you try to ask a question first, and we'll help. If you can't, then go ahead. We'll let you. We're not going to block you. You just have to open a case, but try this first. So I think most of the times we've gotten so far with customers is around that. Their follow-up questions are more educational, but the beginning start of the conversation is. But internally, when we talk to our own employees about using this tool that we've had for a while now, they've expanded. Like it kind of started with the support group working technical, but I've heard people on our finance team listening to an all hands call and they heard a product feature and they had no idea what it was. They were using our assistant to educate them what this product is that they're talking about, this feature that's being talked about. And like that part of education enablement like wasn't a thought that we built on, but it's been this knock-on effect across the organization, and we see that across different teams.
Yeah. I mean, I've even used it to teach me some stuff because like we're always learning. I'm still learning too. And it's been invaluable.
Yeah. And the pace of innovation too is so fast
Yeah.
that we can't read all the content, but when there's something interesting to us, that's what's really nice about this. We can ask a question, and instead of reading three product blogs on it and a product documentation, you ask the question, and we actually summarize all that into a targeted answer. And I think that's the real power that we're seeing is that we can just get the answer rather than have to get a link to a doc that might have the answer.
Yep. That's right. That's right. I love that. Well, hey, so now that you've shown the demo, maybe we should talk a little bit about best practices and then we can bring this home with some
Yeah.
resources you can use to learn. So I imagine your team has learned a ton about how to build these things, how to tune them. I'd love to hear from you on just some of those lessons learned, and I can share some that I've seen from the working with customers in the field.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I would double down on is that search and responses and accuracy, I think, is never done. The exercise of thinking about the quality of response will continue to change. And we've seen different inflection points where we've made a change. We've changed models where we went from 3.5 to 4, where we saw answers change. We had some Elasticsearch changes where we said, well, what if we change this search? What if we add synonyms for this? Or what if we do this? What if we add ELSER to this? And we've seen an increase moving from keyword lexical to ELSER and starting to seeing that transition happening. And
Yeah.
so what our thought is that even as new models get introduced and they're quicker, faster, like we still have to have evaluation methods for that.
Yeah.
So our learnings have been how do you start to think about the impact of the changes that we're making and how do we measure them? And so between all the different ways, between the prompt changes, how do you approach the bot and how do you change the prompts based on the questions being asked? How do you tune Elasticsearch to make sure you're getting the right RAG results? And some of the RRF stuff, a fascinating thing we did on our side that is interesting is we actually use generative AI to develop questions on the document that could be answered to get a better hit through semantic search because there was a match there, and we saw an increase again, an inflection point where we had an idea, we had a measurement way to measure accuracy, and we started to see that inflection point again. And so that is a continued exercise on all three of those fronts, from the prompts to Elasticsearch to the models themselves.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, from the field, what I've seen as best practices is sometimes people want to do A/B testing, like they're trying to figure out which model they want to use. And Elastic has the ability to integrate with any of these inference services, right? So you can use them and put users in different swim lanes to see the results or run your tests, right? It's very powerful for that. I think you mentioned RRF. That's another thing where when we talk about hybrid search, what we're talking about is combining lexical and semantic, not just like dense vector, sparse vector, which is most of what everybody else talks about. And that's leading to much better results through things like RRF.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, people are starting to understand that if I want my search experience to be excellent, I need someone looking at what people are searching for, what the answers are coming back on, what feedback they're giving. And I've been somewhat surprised, not surprised, that most companies I talk to don't have someone doing that. In the e-commerce world, it's a core competency. But when you're just adding a search box to your site, it's not really monitored by people. And this is giving, I think, folks a whole new perspective on how to make these experiences amazing and what the benefits are if you do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And on the language model side, it's important. I think you see it in the news about some hallucination or something that happened, and those seem to be dying out a little bit as these models are
Yeah.
getting better.
Yeah.
But when you apply it to very nuanced use cases, it is that much more important that you're verifying the outcomes that are coming. So we've switched between different models. We switched between this different cloud vendors as well, starting to think about trying to compare them. And we found a lot of success with OpenAI on Azure. And we
Yep.
start to think about the results that we're getting that way. They were some of the best that we saw. And so what we did is when we lean into that and start tuning some of the other things, you can see marketed improvements.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay. Well, let's close this out with a little bit of a takeaway for everybody. So Elastic has been focused on providing people with as much information and guidance as possible. And we created this thing called Search Labs, Elasticsearch Labs. You can go to the website. There's also a GitHub repo with a lot of, you know, notebooks and things like that that you can learn from. So I'm going to leave this up for a second. Feel free to scan that QR code. It will take you right to the blog section of Elasticsearch Labs. And I highly recommend you start your journey there and like learn as much as you can. And then we're always available for you. So I lead the AI search team at Elastic, and we help customers all day, every day, evaluate our technology, help them understand how they're going to make it more relevant, and eventually take those things to production. And I have the benefit of having Chris and his team to ask questions of when we get stuck. So it's pretty awesome.
And I would call out if you're interested in more of the business use case and the front end design, back end design, everything related to the assistant that I showed you, we actually have blogs under the Inside Elastic labels there within Search Labs that allow you to like follow our journey. We wrote a lot about it, and there's a lot of interesting tidbits about our build in that process.
Perfect. All right, Chris, I am benefiting from your tool every day. I really appreciate it. Thanks for doing this with us. And everybody, I hope you learned something today and continue your journey with those links below.
Thank you for your time, Steve.
Thanks, man. Thanks, everybody.